Okay, so
That's the whole Gemara.
we mentioned last week. Exactly. We mentioned last week briefly that women are not obligated to recline at the seder.
Oh, right.
So what we're going to do today is go through this question about women reclining at the seder in depth, and it really is a fascinating discussion to me, because it becomes very difficult to put all the jigsaw pieces together, and hopefully I'm going to suggest one possible way of doing so, and hopefully you'll be in agreement. So the Gemara says that women do not require haseba, are not required to recline. If she is an important woman, then she does need to recline. Now, right away, before we get into analyzing anything, we already have two, not necessarily opinions, but sort of, two versions in the Rishonim. We find two editions of this statement in the Gemara. The first edition is the way I just read it to you. The second edition adds in two words. Isha eitzel baila, a woman in the presence of her husband, is not required to do haseba. But if she's a prominent woman, then she does need to. Now, why should a woman be... before we get to the prominent women, let's just talk about the ordinary woman. Why should a woman be parted from haseba? So, we could basically break it down into based on what we have in the Rishonim, we could break it down into three different ways of understanding it. And if you look on the second page of the source sheet, there's a little chart. And the first reason is because it's not the norm for women to recline at the meal. In other words, this practice of yore, that people who were aristocratic or just free people, however you exactly classify it, would recline on a special reclining couch while they were eating their meals, was the practice for men. Women always, forever and all eternity, always used to sit upright during the meal. And therefore, when women... so there's no difference at the core of it. The core is that on the Seder night we sit in the way that free people, that royal people, that prominent people dine. We copy the way they do things. So how do they do things? Well, men recline and women sit upright. So, therefore, men recline and women sit upright. That's the first reason. The second reason is because this is the reason Rashbam says that a woman is the word ema is often translated as fear, but I don't think fear is a good word over here. I think it's reverence. There's a certain awe or reverence that a woman has in the traditional, or for sure in the ancient traditional family. The woman has a certain awe or reverence to the husband, and therefore it's not appropriate, or wouldn't be natural for her to be in such a relaxed mode. Similar, perhaps, to the idea that one does not do haseba in the presence of one's primary Torah teacher, because again, in front of the Rebbe there is tremendous awe and respect, reverence that one has, and it's not appropriate to do haseba. We mentioned that last week as well. And the third reason is in some way similar to the second reason, but that is the reason of the Ran, that a woman is busy serving her husband, waiting on her husband, taking the dishes, putting back new dishes, etc., etc. And therefore, while she is obligated to have a bite of matzah, she has to have the kazayas of matzah. But if you're going to start telling her to get so comfortable, that's too much, because she needs to be up on her toes. Okay? So those are the three reasons that a woman would not require haseba. Now, what would be the practical difference between these reasons?
As a result of his success, the wicked...
Well, like you said, if she's serving the food, she couldn't do it.
He blesses himself.
But on the other hand, for example, Golda Meir was Prime Minister of Israel. So if she sat down at a seder, would she be expected to lean or no?
Okay, so we're going to get to that. That's the next part about the prominent women. But before we get to prominent women, just ordinary women, what's the difference? What would be a practical difference between the first reason, which is just that it's not the norm for women to recline, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the second and third reason that it has something to do with her relationship with her husband?
Well, if she's the boss of the family, then she'll recline.
Okay, but just think a bit more. Let's try and think a bit more in the box. That's a very good point. But we're going to get there. But just before we get to any sort of unusual cases, just in the regular circumstance, well, if a woman's not married or she's not in the presence of her husband, she's never been married, she's a divorced, she's a widow, her husband's out of town, whatever the case is, and she doesn't have this reverence to her husband, or she's not serving him, so then according to the second and third reason, she would still be obligated to recline. According to the first reason, she wouldn't be able to, because it's nothing to do with her husband. Women don't recline. It's not a normal thing for women to do. Now, sorry?
We're saying Bas Mitzvah and over?
Why? I mean, I wasn't.
What age?
What would
What
be?
age?
Like every mitzvah, from the age of chinuch, from the age of bas mitzvah, they're obligated to do it. They're in their own right, and beforehand, their father's obligated to educate them to do so.
What did you do in your house? Did your mother?
In my house, the women do not recline.
Okay.
Now, in Shulchan Aruch, it says a woman is not required to do her seder unless she is a prominent woman. Now, like we said, the Gemara says if she's a prominent woman, she needs her seder. That's on actually the first page of your source sheets. So that's the words of Shulchan Aruch. A woman is not required to do her seder unless she is a prominent woman. Now, from the fact that the Shulchan Aruch does not differentiate between a married woman or a single woman, it would seem, that the Shulchan Aruch understands like the first reason, that the reason women do not recline is because it's not the norm for women to recline, and therefore there's no difference between a married woman or a single woman. Right? Okay. Now, then the Gemara continues, and again Shulchan Aruch quotes this, that a prominent woman does need to does recline. Now the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch both don't specify what does a prominent woman mean, and we find in the commentaries perhaps three definitions of what it means, and as we'll see, and I've made this in the chart, that each, depending on what you hold the reason for a woman not to recline is, that will determine your options of what prominent woman could possibly mean. So for example, starting from the bottom up, some suggest that a prominent woman means somebody who has servants, somebody who has maids and servants in the house to take care of all the, for example, serving the food, right? So if you say that, so the Ran, according to the Ran, that would be the definition of a prominent woman. So he says a woman doesn't need to recline because she's busy serving her husband. But if she has servants to serve her husband, so then she does recline, right? If you say, for example, that the reason not to recline is, let's say the first reason, that it's not the norm for women to recline, then whether or not she has servants is entirely irrelevant, right? So that's the point of this chart. You see that whatever reason, the definition of prominent women depends on what the reason why women don't recline is. Right? If you say the reason women don't recline is because she's waiting on her husband, so then the definition of a prominent woman who does need to recline is a woman who has servants. Right? If you say that, let's go from the top now. We'll get to the middle in a moment. So we've done the bottom one. Let's go to the top one. If you say the reason is like the she'iltus, and this is very important to remember, by the way, that again, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't differentiate between married women and not married women, and therefore it's apparent in the Shulchan Aruch that the reason why women don't recline is because it's not the norm for women to recline. So what does it mean that a prominent woman does recline? What well, perhaps similar to what Mark said about Golda Meir, that an usually women don't recline, but a unique woman who is either very famous or very God-fearing or very prominent family or aristocrat or some sort of, not just a regular woman, but she's some sort of, elevated social status, she's an entrepreneur, whatever it is, somebody who's not just a run-of-the-mill woman. So then, for such a woman, perhaps it was the norm to recline. So according to the Shiltus, that's what a prominent woman means. Normal women don't recline, and therefore normal women don't need to recline. But if you are, a prominent woman, so then you have to recline. Now, the Rashbam, who says that the reason a woman doesn't recline is because out of reverence to her husband, so perhaps he has two choices of what prominent woman could mean. It could either mean the same as the Shiltus, that even though a regular woman has some sort of reverence to her husband, but if she's the president of the United States, so then not necessarily does she have such strong reverence to her husband, and therefore it would be okay for her to recline. Alternatively, if she's the master of the home, which, like I said before, if she's not married, so then according to Rashbam, she would also be counted as a prominent woman.
Can I ask you a question on that opinion? The city understands the same way. Would be, if she's aristocratic, and in reference to her husband is probably the king. So she might also, even if she's prominent,
right.
She's in a prominent position, she probably also has her husband that's prominent, and therefore wouldn't lean in front of him.
You think
it seems like he doesn't hold like the other opinion.
If she is isha chashuva b'maaseha v'priyodeha, so that doesn't necessarily mean that her husband is also.
Oh, you're saying she's in a state of prominence. You're saying just herself, not an aristocratic necessarily.
Yeah, the aristocratic was my word. Okay, so those are the various opinions of women. Now, where it gets tricky is there is a Mordechai. The Mordechai is one of the commentaries one of the early commentaries on the halachic commentaries in the Talmud, and he makes a statement which is quoted in Shulchan Aruch as well. And here's where it gets very sticky, because he says that nowadays all women are prominent, and all women should recline.
What?
And it says in Shulchan Aruch that nowadays all women are prominent and all women must recline. Now, it also says in Shulchan Aruch why, practically speaking, women don't recline, and I alluded to that last week, and we'll get to that soon. But let's sort of just go with the flow right now, right? So imagine, don't confuse me with the facts yet. So imagine, don't think about what happens at your seder. In Shulchan Aruch it says women don't need to recline at the seder. It doesn't say why, but like I said, from the fact that Shulchan Aruch doesn't differentiate between married women and not married women, it would seem to suggest that the reason women don't need to recline is because it's not the norm for women to recline. Then the Shulchan Aruch continues that prominent women do need to recline, which would appear to mean that it is the norm for prominent women to recline, and therefore they need to recline. Okay, and then the Shulchan Aruch continues with stage number 3. It's actually the Ramah, but it sort of goes in flow with the Shulchan Aruch. That so for Sephardim we wouldn't have so many problems, but for Ashkenazim and the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, so then continues that nowadays all women are prominent, and therefore all women need to recline.
But that's not the accepted view. That's a minority.
Hold on, don't worry yet don't get practical on me yet. Right? Just let's try and make sense of these 3 statements. Women don't need to recline because it's not the norm for women to recline. If there are prominent women and it is the norm for them to recline, then they need to recline. Nowadays, all women are prominent. What does that mean? Nowadays, it's the norm for all women to recline? No, it's not. It's not even the norm for men to recline. That's A. B, what does it mean nowadays women are all prominent? However we spoke about these different definitions of prominence, whether she's the master of the home, she has servants, she's exceptionally God-fearing or socially respected. All women today have servants, all women today are socially respected and extraordinarily God-fearing, all women are the master of the home. What changed? What does this mean that nowadays all women are prominent women? What does that even mean?
What is the urgency or the,
Not that I'm aware of.
especially the Mordechai has, of the impropriety of if an important woman does not recline? What is the impropriety if they don't? What do they do?
I'm not sure I'm understanding
They
your
say
question.
aristocratic or important women should recline.
Right.
What is the impropriety if they don't? What if they don't?
Not Yotza.
Well, if
that the man, like-
because what we spoke last week about not being Yotze. If you have an obligation to recline, so then if you don't recline, you've neglected an obligation. And we spoke last week that the way the Rebbe understands it, you've actually neglected two obligations. You've neglected your obligation to recline, and you've also neglected your obligation to eat matzah in a reclining fashion.
So it's like the men. All right.
Right? Yeah. Then she becomes equal to men.
The wicked person not seeking knowledge.
So that's the key word, equality.
Search for new knowledge.
Okay, you're onto something. But we're not. Hold on. So
So you have to get a servant, a cleaning lady, and all
Yeah,
the
that's
9
what we
yards.
yep.
Right, that's what they
Really?
said.
No.
Yeah,
No. Okay.
I'm poor. I can't afford that. I want her to do the bread. No more buying from the grocery store.
Now, so the Chidah actually suggests a very straight. Before we get to Remark's suggestion about equality,
It's not a suggestion, it was an observation.
the Chidah he says something strange. He says that nowadays, when we say that nowadays all women are prominent, it's because nowadays all women are prominent. It's because what it means to say is that nowadays it's not the norm for men or women to recline. So because it's not the norm for men to recline and we recline anyway, so therefore women should recline anyway, even though it's not the norm for them to recline. But when I read that, I had the same reaction as Dan. What's the connection? If you say men have to recline, it's not because it's not the norm for them to recline, it's despite the fact that it's not the norm for them to recline. Men have to recline because it used to be the norm for them to recline, and therefore it was legislated that men have to recline. And therefore, despite the fact that it's not the norm for them to recline, we continue reclining. But why would that have any effect, right? Why would that have any? I think this is probably what your confused face was alluding to. That why would the fact that it's not the norm for women to recline change the fact that there was never a legislation for ordinary women to recline?
But you have the same conflict because if men are superseding the norm, you could have women superseding the norm in the same way.
Right. Yeah, but superseding the norm doesn't mean that it becomes normal for nobody to recline, and then therefore. Right.
No, it should have gone the other way.
Right. Okay. Actually, you may know. Do you know Rabbi J.J. Kuperman, who was the guest speaker here for Hey Tavis last year from Israel? So he once wrote an article about this years ago, and he suggested, actually, I thought something. It was actually a genius suggestion, but I don't think it's true. His idea was that what made women prominent was the fact that the Cherim de Rabbeinu Gershom instituted that men were no longer that polygamy was outlawed. So once men were no longer allowed to have multiple wives, it gave men and women sort of equality, and therefore women also became prominent. I don't think, I mean, it's a nice idea, but I don't think it's true, because this idea that nowadays all women are considered prominent is quoted by the Sephardi authorities as well, and they never accepted the Rabbeinu Gershom's ban on polygamy. So as Rabbi Vadi Yosef of blessed Rabbi Vadi Yosef of blessed memory was actually very adamant that the Ashkenazi practice banning polygamy should not be imposed on Sephardim. Now, that doesn't mean that Rabbi Vadi Yosef, in practice, held that should be carried out in usual situations, but there were certain unique situations. For example, it does happen sometimes where, for whatever reason, the wife is not available to receive a get. And so usually we have the stories of the agunas where the women are chained, but it does happen once in a while that a man could get chained by, for whatever reason, the woman. Now with a man, because there's no biblical prohibition against polygamy, so there's sort of more room to work with. So even if for Ashkenazim, there are workarounds under extreme situations. But Rabbi Eliyahu Yosef held that for Sephardim there's no problem whatsoever. But anyway.
Except, Rabbi, in Israel, there's a law that you can only have one
right,
wife.
so Rabbi Eliyahu Yosef
They made the exception only for the Ammonites who came that already had more than one wife.
So Rabbi Eliyahu Yosef was very against that rule, and he felt it was an atrocity that Ashkenazi practice was being
Forced on
this Sephardi community.
Can I ask a question? How do we get how before nobody gives a get to women? How come all of a sudden you can give a get? Like now these days, everybody's getting divorced. Like
that's a very good question, but I think it's a bit beyond the scope of this class.
Connected with
Why?
them reclining by the seder.
It is exactly.
because we start giving gets.
Getting the get after we
Because we
right?
because
After
no
Yes.
because we start giving gets
Because of
to
quality.
women
That's what
now.
it said.
Now it's like back in the old days, a woman get divorced from her husband as a Jewish woman. It was a big sin. Doesn't matter what it is, you stay. Now it's like nothing. I'm married today. Tomorrow I gotta get. I leave. So where's the quality of your Jewish families now? I see it disappearing. It's not like it used to be.
Okay.
A completely different discussion.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Let's move on. So
Not even in gets.
Moshe Feinstein has a suggestion, which he actually doesn't say it about. He doesn't say this. He says it in the Rashbam. Okay, we'll get that in a minute. What Moshe's suggestion is that the women being prominent means that in times of yore, women were socially second-class citizens. They were there to serve the husband. They were there to serve the family. They weren't.
So you're saying the Rashi is right in
They were second. Everyone knows some basic history. They were second-class citizens, and nowadays, they're almost going to allow women to vote. So it's So Ramosha says that what happens is that there was this change that suddenly the man realized that they need the women as much as the women need the men, right? Men serve a certain role in the family, in the husband and wife relationship, but women also serve a role. And therefore, men are not the cat's whiskers because men need women and women need men.
So he's targeting a need.
Now, this question, the question that I'm posing to you now, is a very difficult question when you're studying it, and nobody until Ramosha sort of came up with this, what might appear to be an obvious.
So what did he say?
What might appear to be an obvious approach. What he's saying is that when we say that nowadays all women are prominent, what that means is that nowadays women are no longer second-class citizens. It used to be that women were second-class citizens. Women were not as important as men, and therefore they didn't recline. Nowadays, we're going to get to the fact that still nowadays nobody reclines. I haven't forgotten about that. But first, just to get the word, the sort of the words should make sense. What does it mean when we say nowadays all women are prominent? What that means to say is, it's true that nowadays there's still women who don't have servants, and there's still women who are not exceptionally God-fearing and socially respected more than all other women. But all women today are socially respected more than all women 1,000 years ago.
Very Klein.
And that, sorry, yeah.
When did the first guy say that all women are now prominent? When was that done?
The Mordechai. Anybody has a phone on them and want to Google when the Mordechai lived? I would guess about 500 years ago.
Okay. So he did it when women were not all emancipated.
Well, you also have to know he was an Ashkenazi, so I believe that I don't know if the emancipation is the right word, but that's for want of a better word. The emancipation of women, my understanding is, probably happened in the Ashkenazi countries, in European countries, earlier than it happened in Egypt and Spain and etc.
So this happened at that time then?
That's the suggestion.
Okay.
Now, before I go further, to me there's a tremendous insight over here, because essentially what Ramosha is saying is that modernity has something to offer us, and that and sort of the reason why nowadays Shulchan Aruch says that nowadays all women are important is because of modernity, right? And I believe that to me this is the reason why this is so important or meaningful is because we have this tension with modernity. We don't want to embrace modernity. We don't want to embrace all the mishigasim that are going on in the world. We're here to fight for Torah values to be prominent. That's right. And Ramosha was a very powerful fighter in that field. Ramosha was one of in America. He was perhaps the foremost fighter against having any association with reform and conservative rabbis, and these sort of the winds of modernity was something that we have this tension with. And here Ramesh is saying that actually there's one aspect of modernity that teaches us to respect women is actually it's a reality, and it's a very good thing. And of course there's many, and it's not like Ramesh is inventing something new. I mean, the Gemara talks about how important women are, and that a man only has bracha in life because in the merit of his wife, and parnasa, and all sorts of things that are there in the merit of women. But it took time until this infiltrated into society, and like we said, I think it infiltrated in Ashkenazi society quicker than it did into Sephardi society, perhaps because the Sephardim lived with the Muslims, so the Ashkenazim lived with Christians and the Sephardim lived with Muslims, so there was the society of the land, which had an impact as well. Yes.
You have two things here.
By the way,
First, you have in 1850 era the beginning of reform movement. Then you have in the 20th century the women's movement, spearheaded by Jewish women from Orthodox families who supposedly got fed up with being treated unequal. So first you have a reform movement, and then on top of it you have a women's movement.
Okay.
So today you end up with a woman rabbi.
Okay, so let me clarify that we're not talking here about feminism. Ramosha wasn't embracing feminism by any stretch of the imagination, right? We're talking about 500 years ago. The emancipation of the women 500 years ago didn't even dream in the wildest imagination about women rabbis or any other of the Mishigasin of the feminist movement. But the fact that women are given equal value as men are, that is something which is a positive thing, which didn't always used to be that way. Well, now, even in Torah, that doesn't mean that there's no difference between men and women. We say every day a bracha shelo ani isha, and as not PC as this may be, al pi halacha, if there's a man and woman drowning, given all the circumstances and the criteria met, you're obligated to save the man before you're obligated to save the woman. And the same is true when a kohen and a levi are drowning, right? If chas v'shalom, myself and my father-in-law are both drowning, my father-in-law is a levi, and you were to be able to save only one of us, you would be obligated to save him because he's a levi, right? So we do. It's not like we're throwing away the hierarchy of kedusha and various levels, and we're not completely bought into the American dream of everyone's equal, and right. That's not what it's about. The American dream of everything being equal is coming from a starting point of life is about us, life is about me. So right? But Yiddishkeit doesn't have that. Our approach to life is we're not the starting point, we're the end point. The starting point is God, and we're here in service of Him, right? So this idea that I have to be equal and it's not fair that somebody else should have an opportunity that I don't have is a very selfish value of American society. But this is exactly where the nuance of Ramosha is impressive, because you could say, one second, modern society is terrible, and feminism and Americanism and whatever, modernity, I'm not even gonna look at it. That might be the natural way for somebody who's looking to not embrace modernity to react, to respond. And here, Ramosha, who's not embracing a modernity at all, but he was able to say that here we have one element of development of modernity that is something that we are embracing. Okay, I want to move on. It's ready. It's coming close. I want to move on. So now, Ramosha says this in a slightly different context. I'm sort of copying and pasting it a little bit. What I want to suggest is like this: women don't recline. Why not? We said a few reasons, but the halachic reason, the reason that we primarily accept seems to be because it's not the norm for women to recline. Now ask yourselves the question: why is it not the norm for women to recline? Well, the reason it's not the norm for women to recline is the same reason it's not the norm for slaves to recline, because women are second-class citizens. So if she's a isha chashuva, if she's a prominent woman, then she would recline because she wasn't a second-class citizen. So then it follows that nowadays that all women are equal citizens to men, and we're all first-class. Men and women are both first-class citizens, or both second-class. Yeah. So platform 9 3/4. So now that all that men and women are equal in that respect, so then it should follow that there should be no difference between men and women, because were the women. Of course, nowadays, it's not the norm for anyone to recline year-round, right? Nobody is negating that. But the reason why it was not the norm for women to recline is because they were second-rate citizens. So it's as if to say like this: the legislation was. The legislation of Haseba was that anybody who's a prominent person, who's not a second-class citizen, who's not second best, should recline because that's what people do, right? So nowadays women don't recline, but because nowadays nobody reclines, right? But were the legislation were the women today to have been around at the time that the legislation was made, they wouldn't have been excluded from the legislation. The only reason they were excluded from it is because at that time, 1,000 years ago, they were considered second-rate citizens. Okay.
But what if a woman insists on reclining?
Okay, one second. We're not finished yet.
That's
Okay.
now, we're getting there.
We get it now.
Okay.
The Ramah finishes off his discussion of this matter by saying that nowadays all women need to recline because all women are prominent. However, it is not the custom for women to recline because they rely on the opinion of the Rav Yah that nowadays nobody needs to recline. And that's why nowadays women don't recline. Now, what does this Rav Yah mean? Well, this Rav Yah is, and I actually alluded to this in the last 2 minutes of the class last week, but it was in a rush, and I'm sure it probably needs to be repeated. What the Rav Yah says is like this, and I'm extrapolating a bit just to explain it a little bit better. What he says is that actually there was never a legislation to recline at the seder night. There was no legislation that your body should be in this position specifically. The legislation was that you should dine at the seder night, wine and dine on the seder night, in the manner of aristocracy. Yes, how you pronounce that word? Aristocracy. So that's the legislation. So you should make sure you're sitting comfortably. The last week we discussed at the end that you're not allowed to eat. Nobody, not men or women, are allowed to eat the matzah or drink the 4 cups of wine standing up. Because snacking and just walking around and eating, that's not a royal way of eating, right? Prominent people don't munch around standing up. So, you can eat matzah standing, but the kazayas matzah that you have to eat, the kazayas and the kairech and the afikim and the matzah that's part of the seder, has to be done, even for women, at a sitting comfortable position, not standing up, not rocking the pram. So, the way the Rav Yah understands it is that he's different than everybody else. He says, no, there was no legislation that you have to sit, that you have to recline at the seder. The legislation was that you have to sit in a comfortable way, as is the norm of the times that you are living in. So in a time when the norm was for people to recline, then you had to recline. Today, not just today, already in the times of the Rav Yah, when the norm was for people to the norm is for people to year round to sit up straight in a regular chair when they're eating, then that's the way to do so. And if there may be some tribes or whatever who don't sit on chairs, and the way they sit always is by crouching, by sort of squatting. There are such things, right? So naturally, the way if you ever notice this, naturally humans squat. That's the way. If you look at young babies when they start playing with toys and everything, they're squatting on their legs, and they could sit for hours just squatting. But as we get older and we're used to sitting on chairs, our muscles can't do it. And you try and squat in the position of babies, with your feet flat on the ground, squatting. After 30 seconds, you'll be in pain and you'll fall over, right? So if there are tribes, I don't know where, who that's the way. I mean, they're not Jewish, but in theory, right? If there would be a Jewish tribe who that's the way they're used to sitting. So according to the Rav Eliyahu, that's the way they would sit on the seder night.
But they compose of like precious metals and
Now,
Well, I can say if you're an aristocrat, you want to express your aristocracy by saying, I'm going to do it any way I want to because I'm an aristocrat. So you can say, any way I eat is I'm empowered to do so because of my status. So.
Yeah, but that we're not talking here about. I mean, think of Queen Elizabeth. Yeah. In other words,
head of the throne, she could do it any way she wants.
She could, but part of the no, she can't, because monarchy has a code of behavior. I mean, monarchy is not necessarily the right word over here, because we don't need to be like Malachim. We need to be like Bnei Chayrin, right? So, because that's if you want to really sort of peck through the needles over here, in some Rishonim it says to sit k'derech hamalachim, and in some to sit in the way of kings. In some places it says to sit like bnei chorin, like free people. Now you might have noticed when I've been talking, I always say like free people, like royalty, like because the exact definition of who we're supposed to be emulating is not so clear.
But why we end up sitting in uncomfortable position?
So that I spoke about last week already. That's actually wrong. You have to make sure you're in a comfortable position. That's part of the obligation of a seder. It's not about. That's why I say I don't use the word leaning, I use the word reclining. You make sure you turn your chair around, you get yourself a cushion, you sit like this. It's not as comfortable for us, we're used to sitting like this, so it's never going to be as comfortable to eat like that as it is like this. But as much as possible, you have to make sure that you're in a comfortable position.
Yeah, so now we're changing our tradition. We're adapting to European tradition. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
You're not sitting
Hold on. So now that I've explained to you what the Rav Eliyahu says. Now let's go back and read the Ramah, and it's almost all going to make sense. But I think there's still one link missing over here. So he says like this: women don't require heseba. That's because it's not the norm for women to recline. Why is it not the norm for women to recline? Because 1,000 years ago, women were second-rate citizens. They didn't recline. If she's a prominent woman, then she does need to recline. In other words, if 1,000 years ago there had been a unique woman who was different than all the others, she would have to recline. And nowadays all women are prominent because nowadays all women are not second-rate citizens. However, in practice they don't recline because they rely on the Rav Eliyahu that nowadays nobody needs to recline. So now I've read to you the whole Ramah, it all makes sense. The only thing that still requires clarification is that essentially what we're saying is that there's no difference between men and women. So if there's no difference between men and women, why is it that men recline and we don't rely on the Rav Eliyahu, and women recline because they do rely on the? I mean, if the Rav Eliyahu, which one is it? Why are the men not relying on the Rav Eliyahu that nowadays nobody needs to recline, and the women are relying on them? So I believe that the pshat is like this: that.
What about sneeze part? We didn't mention it all.
Why?
It's not sneeze for women to recline.
Why is it not sneeze for women to recline?
Why?
Oh, it's not
I'd
sneeze.
say it softly.
What? It's not sneeze for women to be ostentatious. You don't have to be ostentatious to recline. You could just. It's not sneeze for women to sit like this.
Yeah, it's not.
Well, that's your definition. Maybe.
Why is it not sneeze? I mean, perhaps. Perhaps if there's because Mark asked today, practically speaking, Practically speaking, if a woman wants to recline, she's allowed to recline, and there are many families where indeed the practice is that women do recline. Now, you might say that if there's a room full of men and women, and the men are reclining, the women are not reclining, and one woman wants to be different, and she chooses to recline, then I can understand that might be a problem of tznius, because tznius, the idea of tznius is not to stick out, not to be, not. So any sort of extra attention to the women can be defined as not tznius. So then I understand what you're saying. But if it would just become the norm for men and women to recline, so you recline in a, I mean,
if that's the norm. Yeah.
Well, I don't see why I don't see why it's not tznius.
Because I believe because certain body position by nature is not tznius.
No, that's not what tznius means. Tznius
Are you suggesting maybe it's a flaw in you? Maybe you get aroused or something?
No, tznius doesn't mean that women have to pretend that they don't have the figure of a body of a woman, right? Is it not tznius for a woman to wear a seatbelt? Now, wearing very tight clothes is not tznius because that, how do you call it? That accentuates, and the tight clothes are made precisely for that reason, right? They're made to be provocative, right? But I mean, it's sort of going a bit off topic, but
and this is also provocative.
Some women's, some women who are skinny and have certain size or shapes, body parts, are going to be automatically more attractive to most men, than are other women. Does that mean that woman is less tznius? No. Being tznius is not. Being tznius is not about obscuring reality. Being tznius is about being refined. It's very difficult to define and translate tznius. But if you had to say it in one word, it's about being refined. It's not tznius for women to get drunk, right? Why is it not tznius for women to get drunk?
Why?
Because when a person gets drunk, they lose. There's a certain boundary.
They lose the respect.
Right. There's a certain self-respect and boundary that drops. Now that happens to men when they get drunk and to women when they get drunk, right? But there's a big difference between. That's where tznius comes in, because for a man to lose his to sort of let down his guard and lose his respect might be silly and stupid, but it's not. It's not tznius. When a woman does that creates. And one way to test this is that if you get a man and a woman stone drunk, and video record them acting the way they act when they're drunk, and show them the video when they recuperate, the woman would probably be a lot more embarrassed than the man.
I saw women getting drunk.
No, that's not the issue. Let's go back to leading because we're not going to get done.
Okay, let's finish. Okay,
I'm serious.
Yeah.
We need to lead
you're right.
and finish, or we're going to get lost.
Okay, fine. That's fine.
That's fine.
We discussed a little bit. Let me just finish the idea of the thing. So why I believe it's like this? Me'ikar hadin. That means. And strictly speaking, we paskin like the Rav Yah. That means we paskin that nowadays reclining is not an obligation, because nowadays it's not the norm to recline, and therefore there's no obligation to recline. Strictly speaking. Now, for example, what this would mean practically is that if we mentioned last week, if a person ate matzah and forgot to recline, and then he eats it, then the halacha is that he should eat it again, and recline second time round. We won't tell him make a bracha again of a bracha al achilas matzah, because if you say that reclining like it used to be was an absolute obligation, so you didn't fulfill your obligation, so you have to make the bracha again. Nowadays, me'ikar din, the Rav Yah is right. There is no obligation to recline, and therefore you're going to eat matzah again reclining just because we're doing it extra stringent. But at me'ikar din level, there's no obligation to recline. So what I'm suggesting is as follows: two societal shifts happened somewhat simultaneously. One societal shift was that women became prominent. That means that people started to realize that women have the same value as men, and that that men and women both provide something for each other, and therefore people started respecting women more, and they became prominent members of society. At the same sort of time, again, obviously these things didn't happen at one place from one minute to the next, but at the same sort of time, the norm that people ate in a reclining fashion was starting to dwindle and fade out. Right? So, what happened is you come to the seder, and nowadays, and suddenly, I'm making it a bit more drastic just to bring out the point. So last year, the woman was just like one of the kids, and she was second-class citizen, and the man, he sat on his couch, the same couch he reclined on the rest of the year, because he reclines every day, right? Between last Pesach and this Pesach, suddenly that couch has gone into storage, because nowadays we all sit on straight things. At the same time, the woman has been promoted to come and sit next to her husband and be an equal member of the family. So what do we do now? There's no. So what happens is like this. The man says, well, you know what? There's no strict obligation for me to recline, because, like the Rav Yah said, nowadays it's no longer the norm to recline. There's no strict obligation. But you know what? That's what I've always been doing. I've always reclined in the Seder night. So I'm going to get my couch out of the storage and I'm going to recline tonight. The woman, on the other hand, she's like, you know what? I've just become a prominent woman this year. I've been promoted. And were this to have happened 10 years ago, I would be reclining now. But nowadays, nobody ever reclines anyway. Reclining is not a big deal anymore. Like the Rav Yah said, nowadays there's no obligation to recline. So I didn't recline last year. I'm not going to recline this year. And that's how the minhag developed, that nowadays men recline, even though strictly speaking they could rely on the Rav Yah, but nevertheless it's our practice not to, because our ancestors used to recline on Pesach. And women don't recline because even though they are now considered prominent members of society, but their ancestors never reclined in Pesach, and therefore they follow the Ikar Hadin of the Rav Yah, that there's no obligation to recline anymore, and that brings to a close the discussion on reclining. Clear?
Very good.
So we don't lean
One
anymore.
second, I want to make sure I have Dan's approval to close the
I
subject.
still say for Shalom bias.
I get to do whatever I want.
A
I
woman-
want to do this, I do this. I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that.
Well, it's not
It's
you.
the same statement being interpreted two different ways by two different people for their own continuum.
Right. But there's legitimacy to both of them.
I understand that. But you kind of understand, like, the law is the law, and it applies equally to everybody.
But there's a difference between law and custom. Now, custom
but
doesn't.
you're
Custom
telling-
doesn't mean, because custom doesn't mean it's not binding. There could be a custom that's binding, but when it has the halachic status of custom, what that means is that the custom is defined by the way it developed. Now, once the custom developed, it then became sort of a binding custom. It didn't become law, it became a binding custom. And the way it becomes a binding custom is because once the whole, it's like kitnias. Once the whole community has accepted upon themselves a certain practice, then even though whatever, the custom remains binding. But there's still a difference between a custom and a law in this in the mechanics of how they work. That's the difference.
I understand that.